There comes a moment in life when silence speaks louder than confrontation, when your absence echoes more powerfully than your words ever could. Not because you vanished in bitterness, but because you finally chose yourself over the chaos that once drained you. They thought you'd stay, they thought you'd always be there, forgiving, understanding, waiting, but instead you transformed, quietly, without permission, without seeking revenge or validation, and now they live with the weight of that choice, not yours, but theirs. You became the chapter they never thought would close, the light they assumed would never dim, and now they look back and realize you didn't just walk away. You became the lesson, you became their regret. The consequences of misjudging loyalty. There is something profoundly misunderstood in today's world. Loyalty. It is often taken for granted, underestimated, or worse, mistaken for weakness. When someone consistently shows up for you, defends you when you aren't present, believes in you when you don't believe in yourself, that's not dependency. That's character. That's someone who values connection, who chooses integrity even when it isn't convenient. But here's the painful truth. Loyalty is most visible in its absence. When people misjudge loyalty, it's rarely because they lack intelligence. More often, it's because they are too consumed by temporary validation, surface-level distractions, or their own wounded ego. They begin to believe the illusion that someone will always be there, no matter how carelessly they are treated. That illusion shatters the moment the loyal person decides to step away, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. The one who gives endlessly is rarely celebrated while giving. Their efforts become invisible because they are consistent. The check-ins, the kind gestures, the emotional support, it all begins to feel like background noise to those receiving it. But that background noise is actually a lifeline, and when it disappears, the silence speaks volumes. Many people don't understand the weight of emotional safety until it's gone. They recognize loyalty only in the echo of its absence. It's easy to take someone for granted when you're convinced they will never leave. It's easier still when your ego convinces you that you're the one in control, that you're the one being pursued, admired, or chased. That illusion breeds entitlement, and entitlement blinds us to the treasures we already hold. And what often makes it worse is this: the loyal ones rarely make dramatic exits. They don't burn bridges. They don't scream for attention. They simply begin to choose peace. They walk away with quiet strength, leaving behind no destruction, just a void. And that void is often the first thing that opens the eyes of those who misunderstood their worth. There's a kind of sorrow that arrives not from being left, but from realizing why someone left. It's the realization that you had someone in your corner, someone who would have walked through fire beside you, and you traded that for temporary ego boosts, superficial praise, or shallow connections. That kind of regret is not easily shaken. It lingers. People who misjudge loyalty often look back later, not just with sadness, but with confusion. They don't understand how someone who gave so much, who loved so deeply, could walk away. But they forget that even the most loyal heart has limits. Even the most forgiving soul eventually chooses preservation over sacrifice. In time, they start seeing that loyalty wasn't weakness, it was strength. A rare kind of strength. The strength to stay when things were hard. The strength to believe in someone's potential even when that person couldn't see it themselves. And once they realize what they've lost, they may search for it in others. But loyalty like that isn't something you find by looking, it's something you earn by being consistent, honest, and present. So when they remember you, they remember more than just your presence. They remember the weight of your care, the steadiness of your support, and the rare comfort of knowing someone had their back unconditionally, and that memory, that awareness of what they once had and no longer do, that's the beginning of regret. You became their regret not because you wanted revenge, not because you disappeared to make a point, but because your presence was misread, your loyalty misused, and your heart misjudged, and now in your absence they finally see what they failed to honor. The power of silent transformation. There is a certain kind of growth that doesn't make noise. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't beg to be seen. It happens quietly in the background, away from the crowds, in the privacy of one's own healing. This is the kind of transformation that often goes unnoticed until it can no longer be denied. When you were broken, you didn't respond with bitterness. You didn't lash out or try to match their indifference. Instead, you chose silence, not the silence of surrender, but the silence of someone who is rebuilding. You went inward. You started asking deeper questions. Who am I without them? What do I actually want? Why did I accept less than I deserved? And those questions didn't lead to rage, they led to clarity. While they assumed you were still stuck in the past, still thinking of them, still waiting, something far greater was happening. You were evolving, not for their attention but for your own peace. You were no longer trying to prove your worth, you were learning to see it. The energy you once gave away freely, you started reclaiming. Slowly, quietly, consistently. The world often expects recovery to be loud, filled with declarations, drastic changes, or obvious success. But true healing doesn't always follow a dramatic script. Sometimes it's just waking up and choosing not to check your phone for messages that won't come. Sometimes it's going for a walk instead of overthinking. Sometimes it's finally saying no without guilt. These seem like small things to the outside world, but for someone who's been hurt, they are massive steps forward. People rarely notice the day you decide to stop shrinking yourself. They don't see the inner shift when you stop begging for closure and start creating it for yourself. They might not even notice when your absence starts to speak louder than your presence ever did. But eventually they do. There comes a moment, maybe weeks later, maybe years, when they suddenly feel the gap. They sense something has changed, not in you physically, but in the energy you no longer offer. They reach out and find distance where there used to be devotion. They look for the same version of you, but that version no longer exists. Because you didn't just move on, you outgrew the space you once settled for. What makes silent transformation so powerful is that it doesn't seek validation. You're not performing your growth for anyone. You're not curating it for praise. You're doing it because something inside you finally said, I deserve better than this. That realization becomes the turning point. And the beauty of it is that it can't be undone. Once your perspective changes, the old patterns lose their grip. While they were distracted, comfortable, or dismissive, you were turning pain into strength. You were using every disappointment as fuel, and now they look back and see someone unrecognizable, not because you became someone else, but because you finally became yourself. Fully, authentically, without fear. And this is where regret starts to form in their mind. They don't just regret losing you, they regret not recognizing the depth you carried when it mattered. They regret mistaking your patience for passivity, your softness for naivety. They regret not seeing that your silence wasn't weakness, it was wisdom in motion. In the end, your transformation speaks for itself, without confrontation, without revenge. Just quiet growth, just a life that moves forward without them in it. And that, more than anything, becomes the loudest message of all. Regret, the shadow that arrives late. Regret is never punctual. It doesn't arrive in the heat of the moment, when words are thrown and bridges are burned. It waits. It lingers in the background, uninvited but inevitable. It waits for silence. It waits for space. It waits for the absence of the one they thought would never leave. And when it arrives, it doesn't knock softly, it crashes in, carrying the full weight of everything they didn't see, didn't say, and didn't do when they had the chance. In the beginning, they may feel nothing. They move on, distracted by new people, new conversations, or the illusion of freedom. They convince themselves that nothing was lost, that what they let go of was replaceable, temporary, but slowly, life begins to reveal what they actually let slip away. And that's when regret begins to form, not as a sudden storm, but as a slow fog that settles over everything. They begin to remember the moments you stood by them without being asked, the days you listened when no one else cared, the quiet ways you made life easier, softer, more meaningful. These aren't just memories, they are reminders of how rare your presence was. And now that rarity feels unreachable. That's when the shadow of regret grows. What makes regret so sharp is that it comes too late to fix anything. They may replay conversations in their mind, thinking about what they could have said differently. They may scroll through old photos, messages, or shared moments, trying to recapture a connection that no longer exists. But memory is not restoration. Remembering what was doesn't bring back what is no longer available, and while they are just beginning to feel the emptiness, you have already grown past it. Regret, by its nature, traps the one who caused the damage. It forces them to witness the aftermath from a distance. You're no longer standing in that emotional space, waiting for change. You've walked away, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. And from that new place of peace, you see things clearly. They, on the other hand, are left with the realization that the door they once took for granted is now closed, not out of anger, but out of maturity. You didn't leave to teach them a lesson. You left because you finally understood yours. You can't grow while staying in a place where you are undervalued. You can't become who you're meant to be while constantly trying to prove your worth to someone who refuses to see it. Now, every quiet moment they have becomes a space for reflection. They begin to feel your absence in ways they never expected, in conversations where your name once came up often, in routines where your presence was constant, and in their own mind where questions start to surface. Could it have been different? Did they underestimate you? Did they push away someone who truly cared? These questions don't go away easily. They linger. They follow. Because regret is not just about what happened, it's about what could have been. It's about missed chances, unspoken apologies, and the realization that loyalty and love were offered and mishandled. And perhaps the hardest part of regret is knowing the other person has moved on. That while you are looking backward, they are building forward. You became the chapter they wish they had treated better. The story they now read with longing, but no opportunity to rewrite. Regret does not ask for permission. It arrives when the damage is already done, and when the person they hurt has already found peace. And that is what makes it so powerful, because it reminds them too late that what they lost was not just a person, but a version of themselves that was better when you were around. Healing is not just survival, it's superiority without arrogance. Healing is often mistaken for just getting through something, for managing the pain and learning to live with it. But real healing is more than that. It's not only about survival, It's about becoming something stronger, something clearer, and something more deeply rooted in truth than before. And the most powerful healing doesn't come from proving anything to others. It comes from finally understanding that you have nothing left to prove. In the beginning, healing may look like survival. It might mean learning to breathe again after a betrayal. It may mean navigating your days with quiet sadness, while still showing up for yourself. You may not feel powerful at all. In fact, healing often starts from the most fragile place when everything inside you feels uncertain, and all you want is for the pain to stop. But if you stay with it, if you refuse to abandon yourself the way others did, something begins to shift. You stop living in reaction to what was done to you. You stop waiting for apologies or recognition, and instead, you begin building something new, not for them to see, but for you to feel whole again. Your healing becomes an act of self-respect. It's no longer about getting them to notice your worth. It's about realizing that your worth was never tied to their ability to recognize it in the first place. This kind of healing isn't loud or dramatic. It doesn't parade itself for attention. It's quiet confidence. It's found in boundaries you now protect, in standards you now honor, and in peace you refuse to trade for temporary comfort. You start saying no without guilt. You stop explaining yourself to people who aren't listening. You begin to walk through the world differently, not with arrogance, but with understanding. There is a quiet superiority in that kind of growth. Not superiority over others, but over your past self, the one who settled, who tolerated too much, who poured from an empty cup. You don't need to look down on anyone to feel elevated. You don't need to shout your worth to feel valid. You simply begin to live in alignment with who you truly are, and that alone speaks louder than anything else. And here's the powerful irony. When they finally look back, they don't find the version of you they remember. They find someone who no longer needs them, someone who no longer waits for closure or recognition, someone who is no longer reachable in the way they once were. And that realization often hits harder than any confrontation ever could. Because healing that transforms you not into a colder person, but into a wiser one carries a weight they can feel even from a distance. They may still try to return, to reconnect, to test the waters. But the person you became through your healing process no longer fits into the space you once held. You're not holding on to old narratives. You're not seeking revenge. You've simply outgrown the entire situation. That is the essence of quiet strength, to grow without bitterness, to rise without noise, to thrive without needing to be seen. You've reclaimed your energy and with it, your sense of direction. And that creates a reality in which their regret can't follow you. It can only observe from afar. So healing in its truest form becomes a kind of elevation not over others, but over pain, over confusion, over the parts of you that were once tied to what hurt you. It's the kind of strength that doesn't need validation. It just exists, and it radiates in everything you do, without ever saying a word. You became the standard they can no longer reach. There comes a time when the person they once underestimated becomes the measure by which they compare everything else. Not because that person tries to be better than others, but because they chose growth over resentment, self-respect over desperation, and peace over chaos. That quiet decision to walk away, to rebuild, to evolve sets a new standard. And that standard becomes a mirror they can't look away from. When someone has been on the receiving end of your unwavering loyalty, genuine care, and emotional presence, they begin to expect that level of connection everywhere they go, even if they didn't appreciate it when they had it. They search for the same depth, the same patience, the same warmth. But what they often find instead is the surface, level engagement that is all too common in a world obsessed with convenience. That's when the realization begins to hit. You weren't just kind, you were consistent. You weren't just present, you were dependable. And you weren't just emotionally available, you were emotionally invested. Those qualities don't appear in everyone. In fact, they're rare, and what makes them even more powerful is that you gave them freely, not to manipulate or control, but simply because that's who you are. They may try to replicate what they had with you. They might seek it in other people, in new environments, or in distractions that mimic connection. But over time, they'll notice the difference not in others, but in themselves. They'll recognize the gap between what they once had and what they now settle for. They'll begin to understand that your presence raised their standard of what love, friendship, and loyalty could look like. But by then, they're no longer close enough to reach you, not because you're out of sight, but because you're out of alignment with who they are now. The gap they feel isn't physical, it's emotional, it's spiritual. It's the distance that forms when someone chooses comfort while the other chooses growth. You didn't just walk away, you kept walking long after they stopped moving. And here's what hurts the most for them, realizing that the version of you they once dismissed now exists beyond their reach. The standard you became was shaped not in spite of the pain, but because of it. Every misunderstanding, every dismissal, every emotional wound, you turned it into strength. You turned it into clarity. You learned how to protect your peace without building walls, how to love without losing yourself, and how to give without draining. Now, you no longer chase, you no longer explain, you no longer settle. You simply live in a way that reflects your growth, and that quiet confidence creates a standard no apology can reach, no second chance can match, and no replacement can replicate. They may remember you in quiet moments, in the way certain songs feel familiar, in the way specific words trigger memories, in the way peace once felt easy in your presence. But those memories, while vivid, remain untouchable. Because they're tied to a version of you that no longer waits, a version that chose healing, wholeness, and forward movement. And that is the final layer of their regret, knowing that while they stayed still, you evolved. You became the version of yourself they couldn't imagine at the time, not out of pride, but out of principle, not to hurt them, but to honor yourself. And that standard, the one you now live by, is the one they may spend years chasing in others, never quite finding again.